Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Vienna Talks between Iran and several world powers regarding the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly referred to as the Iran nuclear deal, have entered their fifth round, with progress towards an agreement on a mutual return to compliance reported as a hopeful indicator, but not enough for a deal. The American side is involved indirectly in a sort of proximity talks, while the focus remains on Iran's nuclear activities and U.S. sanctions imposed on Tehran's economy. To further analyze this topic, we're joined from Washington, D.C. by Dr. Olli Heinonen, who is the former Deputy Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency and a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center at Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Hello from Tel Aviv.
Indeed, and I'd like also to welcome to the panel our TV7 analyst and host of TV7's Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding. Of course, there's beyond the nuclear file, the regional aspirations for the Islamic Republic of Iran that have to do with revolutionary aspirations, as they put it. To what degree is the one intertwined with the other, and are we currently in a crossroads for the time ahead?
So here we are at the start of the month of June with a flurry of diplomatic activity. In mid-month, we are going to see the first Biden-Putin summit. They will obviously touch on that too. Secretary of State Blinken met his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, earlier. And of course, the various parties to the old JCPOA are active diplomatically. Blinken talked with Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, not only because Germany is one of the parties to the nuclear deal, but also because Germany is a non-voting member of the Security Council this time. Now, in addition to what is happening in Vienna, with the American delegation under Rob Malley reporting back to President Biden and Secretary Blinken, getting their approval. We are going to have the presidential elections in Tehran. Obviously, Meir will expand on it. We see that one of the issues is sanctions on terror activities. This is apart from sanctions regarding the nuclear activities, but there is, of course, a debate between the Americans and the Iranians on the definition of what constitutes a terror act. And this brings us to the partners and proxies part of the activities. And one salient example is what the Houthis are doing in Yemen. And therefore, there are now talks between the Saudis and the Iranians, on the one hand, and between the Americans, the Saudis, and the Omanis, on the other hand. The American emissary regarding the Yemen problem has gone to Saudi Arabia and Oman, and obviously messages are going back and forth regarding the cessation, or at least reduction, of Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So something is brewing. Of course, it will have to include the release of dual American-Iranian citizens held by Iran, so that it could be depicted as a humanitarian move. Something will probably move within the next few days or weeks.
Dr. Heinonen, I'd like to ask you with regard to the ongoing negotiations in Vienna. Of course, the International Atomic Energy Agency continues to at least monitor via its tools in the various nuclear installations the ongoing activities of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which since its withdrawal from the deal, it has already raised or ratcheted up its activities to a 66% purity level enrichment of fissile material, which is far beyond civilian applications from what I understand. But if you could give us a little bit of an understanding, the IAEA currently does not have access to all those activities that it is undertaking in an automated way in order to basically verify it, a deal needs to be struck. So currently, from the way I understand, the nuclear watchdog is actually flying blind, and Iran is doing on the ground whatever it pleases?
Yes, indeed. There are quite a lot of restrictions, and I'm a little bit worried about the end result. IAEA has its monitoring equipment at the enrichment plants, and it's now important when they produce 60% enriched uranium, 20% enriched uranium, and 5% enriched uranium that they are continuously monitored. But unfortunately, IAEA doesn't have access to this equipment all the time, but they have to wait until this grace period, which is now on the 24th of June, when they can see how did the equipment operate. And there is a chance that the equipment may have malfunctioned or something else has happened, lights off, and then we lost all this period which are there. Certainly there are some other measures that the IAEA can in a big number get an understanding of what has taken place, but this is a serious restriction, and it's actually a violation in Iran's safeguards agreement, not the JCPOA, not the additional protocol on that sense, but the legal instrument is comprehensive safeguards agreement that they are violating it now.
The safeguards agreement under the non-proliferation treaty, which Iran is a signatory to.
Yes.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Javedanfar, when we're talking about Iran's intentions in this situation, obviously it is quite clear that the Islamic Republic is adamant on seeing this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action revived without any additions to it. It will, of course, salvage its failing economy also after the Chinese activities that occurred with regard to the cryptocurrency, somewhere that the Iranians have invested significant sums of money into. Suddenly they lost a third of all of their investments within 48 hours, bringing the total sum to significant amounts of money, which is not clear to what degree it actually impacted these activities. But I'd like to ask you with regard to actually activities happening on the ground in Iraq at a time when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is being discussed or deliberated. Indirect talks with the United States are seemingly, at least according to the EU chair of the talks in Vienna, have made substantial progress, something also confirmed by President Rouhani. Suddenly we came to the point where we see Iranian proxies once again firing a rocket toward U.S. Bases in Iraq, or Iraqi bases housing U.S. troops. And it seems that the IRGC, on the one hand, is not completely aligned with the political establishment, or how does that exactly work?
Well, I think that the way the IRGC sees it, this is firing missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq is first and foremost negotiations by another means. They see it as increasing Iran's leverage for the time being when it comes to the talks. And especially the fact that America has only responded once, this really boosts the motivation of the IRGC because they have nothing to lose. America is not responding, so they are continuing with their activities. I think even after there's a nuclear deal, if there are going to be U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq, I think that it's very likely that the IRGC will continue for its own goals in terms of domestic Iranian politics. We have to remember that the IRGC, when it comes to the Iranian deep state, derives part of its budget and legitimacy from its extraterritorial activities. These are much to the pleasure and approval of Ayatollah Khamenei. So I think this is likely to continue. But in terms of how the Iranian people say, to be honest with you, I think life in Iran is more difficult than ever before. We saw recently rolling blackouts in Tehran, partly because of those crypto mining equipment, which is sucking up so much of Iran's energy, but also because of the drought. Iran gets about 14% of its energy from hydroelectric sources, and those dams are are running low. So this is the blackouts really hurts the economy, and they will continue to undermine the government because there does not seem to be a solution on the horizon. So this has really pushed down the issue of the nuclear program. And some people are asking why are we paying such huge price for the sanctions for a nuclear program when we have other huge priorities. So this is the situation right now, and we have to wait and see. But Khamenei, for now, it seems that he doesn't want to make a major gesture to the United States in the talks. Maybe it's because he's waiting for the new president to leave the office, or maybe he's trying to see how far he can push the Americans. It's not clear. But the people of Iran pay the price because it seems to many Iranians that Biden is ready for a deal, but Khamenei is not.
Indeed. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Oren, to what degree are the Americans basically resolved on returning into compliance with the deal? Of course, it's a matter of wanting to break away from the Trump administration's foreign policy. And this is part of that, of course. Also, if Iran is broken on the economic scale, it means that it would be in the good graces of China, something that Chinese President Xi Jinping on multiple occasions has indicated Beijing's interest in cooperation, in deeply cooperating with Tehran. But at the same time, there was just recently a statement by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the former, in which he said that once this deal is revived, the United States will be technically paying to a regime that is sponsoring terror against the United States. So in effect, it's paying for terrorism against the homeland. How does that actually allow the Biden administration to implement something when Congress might avert such an endeavor?
Let me first remark in a very brief way something which came up in your exchange with Olli, which may be, your exchange may have been not so reassuring to viewers who may be concerned, lest the 3 and now 4 month hiatus in the verification regime of the IAEA in Iranian facilities could make the Iranians do something clandestinely without the world knowing. What we know up to now regarding the fantastic intelligence capabilities of certain Western services in various countries or vis-a-vis organizations could reassure us that either such services could spy on Iran or at least hack these IAEA cameras, which are still working. They are not at the disposal of the Atomic Agency, but once they are working, someone else from the outside could hack their products and thereby keep an eye on what is happening in Iran. Just a thought, so that it is not as if everyone is blind to what is happening there. Now, regarding the focus of your question, there used to be a legal school of diplomacy believing that agreements are the most important part of the interrelationship between states. Once an agreement was signed, such as the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s or other pacts, then everything is fine, not to mention the Munich Agreement of 1938. There is another realpolitik school which believes that interests dictate what is happening. And apparently Obama and now Biden belong to the other school, which believes that if it will be in Iran's interest, regardless of the fine print in the 2015 deal or the 2021 deal or whatever, then they will do what is also in the best interest of the world or of the United States.
Even if it contradicts their clear aspirations and declared efforts?
And then this is why they believe that had the 2015 deal been followed through, it would have changed the behavior, shaped the behavior of the regime. Of course, if you just take the Khomeini and now Khamenei rhetoric and then project it to the future, there is no hope. But if the regime will be at least slightly changed or put on a trajectory that in 5 or 10 years would change it or would bring some movement from within, whether this is realistic or not, then the clauses in the agreement itself are less important.
Indeed. Dr. Heinonen, I'd like to ask you, when we're talking about the capacity of the International Atomic Energy Agency to truly verify currently whether or not the Iranians are in pursuit of a nuclear weapon, how can it guarantee to the international community at this very stage that Iran is not doing so?
I think that the IAEA cannot do it at this point of time with this international support which it unfortunately has. As you mentioned, this issue, for example, of contamination by natural uranium particles has been on table for almost 2 years. After the March meeting, there were supposed to be meetings between Iran and IAEA. They have met twice in 3 months. That's not very much. So I think that there is now a stalemate and everyone waits for a JCPOA to be problem solved, and then they return back to the IAEA. But at this point of time, this doesn't look very flourishing.
Indeed. Mr. Javedanfar, I'd like to ask you, in the last round of negotiations back in 2015, when the P5+1 and Iran were engaged in diplomacy in order to reach the agreement, the United States apparently asked of Israel to create a credible military threat, possibly projecting a danger to the Iranians that unless they return into or enter into the agreement, they will face a all the options are on the table, so to speak, solution. This seems now in a reality in which the state of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said so repeatedly over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, that with or without a deal, the state of Israel is going to ensure that Iran is not going to attain a nuclear weapon and is going to do it independent from whether the United States agrees to this or not. Whether that is a possibility or not, that's a different question. But I'd like to ask you, to what degree are the Iranians taking Israel seriously?
Well, to be honest with you, the Iranians do take Israel seriously, but I would say the recent Gaza war would have created some new scenarios for Iran. Israel attacked Hamas, which started this war through rockets. And look at how many hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of London, 180,000 people. We saw a massive backlash against Israel. We saw the progressives in the US, Bernie Sanders went even as far as addressing a bill to block the sale of $700 million worth of missiles to Israel. So if Israel cannot get into a war with Hamas without the war up in arms, how can Israel start bombing Iran's nuclear installations in a scenario whereby Israel detects Iran is building a weapon? What I'm trying to say is that the recent Gaza war showed that Israel diplomatically is weak. Israel put too much of its eggs in the basket of Mr. Trump, and now we are paying the price with the Democrats. Also, we have not made any progress with the Palestinians. Although the Iran and Palestine issue, Iran does not want peace with it does not want peace between Israel and the Palestinians. At the same time, the lack of progress in the Israel-Palestinian track hurts Israel's diplomatic credibility, and this undermines Israeli efforts with regards to Iran. So I would say that the Iranians, I think, they may be feeling a little bit more emboldened after the recent war, especially that we saw that Hamas and Jihad Islami used so much Iranian equipment that most of it was apparently assembled inside Gaza. So I would say they would be feeling more emboldened, especially because of the negative Israeli reaction to the Gaza, to Israel's attacks against Gaza. But whether that means that Mr. Khamenei is going to go and say, I'm going to make a nuclear weapon, I don't think so. But I think, yes, they are cognizant. They were viewing the international reaction against Israel with much pleasure and hope. And I think the Iranian regime is quite disappointed that the war ended after 11 days. And I think it's even more disappointed that Israel did not make a ground incursion into Gaza because that could have led to more Israeli casualties.
Indeed, and of course, both Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have come out and thanked Iran for financial support, for its shipments of military arms and technical support. Go ahead.
The fact that the Hamas leadership and Jihad Islami leadership came and thanked the Islamic Republic in the social media, that has led to a major backlash inside Iran, especially now that people of Iran see that their own regime and government have not been investing in Iran's electricity sector over the years, but its funding to Hamas and Jihad Islamic has continued.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
Well, political will to employ Israel's military might notwithstanding, and Hamas being perhaps the weakest of Israel's enemies. Having said that, this is a caveat which one should note. Nevertheless, the Israeli Defense Forces have shown such sophistication, which must have been taken note of in Iran and elsewhere. If you want to put 160 fighters in the air over a very small area, synchronize such an attack. Yes, there were no surface-to-air missiles there. In Iran, it will be much more complicated.
In military terms, it is a masterpiece.
Yes, and not only that, according to foreign reports, even while Israel was doing that, there was at least one strike away from Israel, perhaps around the Syrian-Iraqi border, to intercept Iranian transports to Hezbollah.
In the corridor of Abu al-Kamal, there were various reports about such a strike. Indeed.
Which means that the attention, the command and control of Israel will not be impaired, even if it's a multi-front war. Even if it's Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel, the General Staff, the Air Force, the Intelligence Corps, Mossad, all of them can mount an attack against Iran simultaneously. If you add to that the fact that the IRGC or the Quds Force have really been impaired by the death of Qasem Soleimani, who was the engine behind the proactive policy, the assertiveness of the partners and proxies, you put all of that together, Iran has a lot to fear from Israel if there is either a context or a pretext for an Israeli strike.
Diplomatically speaking, do we have the backing the moment such reality could erupt?
We are far away from such a scenario. The Israeli Director of Military Intelligence, General Amir, put it at least 2 years. But if push comes to shove, Israel can do it.
We're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like each and every one of you to have at least a minute, or not at least a minute, 1 minute max for each of you to have a short analysis or prediction for the future. Dr. Heinonen, how are we heading on this technical aspect of the nuclear negotiations? Do we expect, in your view, to see a JCPOA plus, or may we return into a JCPOA and then hope for the best?
Unfortunately, it looks now for the time being the latter, that people enter the JCPOA with some kind of weak assurances that the other issues we will deal then in the course of this new cooperation, which is opened by the return of US to the JCPOA. And unfortunately, I think that the prospects for success, if that route is taken, will be very, very low.
Indeed. Mr. Javedanfar?
I think we'll see a JCPOA, but I don't think we'll see a JCPOA plus anytime soon. I think the recent Gaza war has actually increased the importance of Iran's missile arsenal to its foreign policy, to its as a tool to project power abroad. And I also think because the Iranian presidential elections will be basically looks like it will be a one-horse race between the conservatives. This means that Iran will now continue in its trajectory of a confrontational foreign policy regarding Israel, and military policy also regarding Israel. And also, I don't think we're going to see a cooling of heads when it comes to the United States. And last but not least, sorry to sound like such a pessimist, I don't see the IRGC allowing Iranian-Saudi relations to develop, because that would undermine their industrial defense complex.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, very shortly, you spoke, of course, about the military intelligence here in Israel, predicting that there is still time until Iran could attain a nuclear missile. However, that same intelligence directorate also anticipates a inevitable confrontation with Iran in the immediate or medium future vis-a-vis the North. How does that one actually coincide with the other?
Well, nothing is really inevitable, because the Israeli side can also shape whatever is happening, and the Biden administration has an input. One can safely say that Israel hopes for the best and plans for the worst, and within the IDF, there is also a JCPOA. It's a Jewish Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Heinonen, Mr. Javedanfar, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.